I'm going to introduce both of our speakers now. They are both co-authors and they know each other extremely well. So I think it makes sense that one presentation would lead into the other. You've seen their impressive bios on the site, so I won't belabor the point, except to say that we are really fortunate to have them with us today. Sanjv Sinha is the Senior Vice President and Board Member at Environmental Consulting and Technology, Inc. He's an expert in sustainable infrastructure, specializing in climate resilience. He also manages the impressive collaboration of Resilient Infrastructure Sustainable Communities, or RISC, which is the publisher of the study, which will be highlighted today. Following him will be Paul Herman, who's the CEO and founder of Hip Investor. That brand says it all. Human impact and profit, and that's Paul's expertise. Paul's latest book as co-author and co-editor is the Global Handbook of Impact Investing, published this year. I just bought the Kindle version and a hard copy for a birthday gift for my favorite investor, so I can attest to that, and I especially appreciate the dedication to strong women in the world. So thanks for that, Paul. It's $40 well spent. But the report Sanjv and Paul co-authored, along with Noah Strauss and Eva Roos, that's the real gift to all of us. So I'll let them take it from here, starting with Sanjv. Sanjv?
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Laura, for your kind introduction. I am Sanjv Sinha. I am based in Ann Arbor, the shining city upon the hill. As they say, it's 55 degrees, and that's the best you can hope for in the middle of March. So welcome. I have you for about the next 10 to 12 minutes. Let me share my screen and see if I can share with you the slide presentation that we have. So if all has gone well, you should be seeing a slide presentation on your screen. I'm going to just assume that you are. The topic for today's discussion is climate resilience and green stormwater infrastructure, risks and opportunities in the Great Lakes. ECT is my employer. I've been with ECT for 2 decades, so a long time. Laura already discussed what risk is, and before I begin, I should tell you that there are 5 parts of my discussion today. The first is I'm going to share with you who is risk, what comprises risk. Second is what exactly is green stormwater infrastructure. Third is the need for finance in water infrastructure. Fourth is the new models that we have come up with that we are now beginning to use across the country. And then fifth is the introduction to our report, and then I'll lean on Paul to do the heavy lifting, discussing the findings of the report itself. Risk is essentially a team of public sector, private sector entities, from ECT and Hip Investor, and then 4 nonprofits, Delta Institute based in Chicago, CNT based in Chicago, CDP, I believe everybody knows, Climate Disclosure Project based in New York and London, and American Society of Adaptation Professionals, or ASAP, awesome acronym, that is based in Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti area, also in Southeast Michigan, but they also work all over across the country. So risk is something that I crafted a 1.5 years ago, and we were very lucky because we pitched the idea to Great Lakes Protection Fund that was willing to underwrite some of the work that we are doing. I really encourage you to go to our website, www.risk.solutions, and consider looking at the reports that we are coming up with and the newspaper articles that are beginning to cite our work. It's very exciting. So very excited to actually be here discussing our work with you. What exactly are we trying to do here in risk? Well, we are, our success is operationalizing the intent for impact. So the way our work has differed is, there are a lot of really high quality water, climate risk reports across the region and across the country. What we are trying to do is to see if we can get transactions done and, basically reduce the costs of implementations. 3 key goals of our project under risk. The first is a cluster of public and private sector professionals that are interested in finance and climate resiliency. We already have about 20 different municipal climate resilience officers. Ron Harris is one of them, and chief sustainability officers across the Great Lakes. We intend to actually scale that up to about 40 people before the year is over. The second goal that we have is to drive down the unit cost of mega-scale green stormwater infrastructure deployments through aggregation. We have written reports that look at how to go about financing green stormwater infrastructure. We are also going to be coming up with standardized templates for design, construction, maintenance, and monitoring. The design one is actually going to hit the street in mid-April. And there is a possibility we may come back in May or June and have a talk on that. The third is the implementing large-scale green stormwater infrastructure to address water quality and climate resiliency. And in all of our work, the socioeconomic impacts are a key to how we go about doing our work. So key accomplishments so far are three. We now have a functioning cluster of municipal leaders across the Great Lakes. We are engaged in two of the largest investments in green stormwater infrastructure in the Great Lakes, and I'll share with you what they are. One is in Greater Milwaukee region, and the second is in Greater Buffalo region. We have already produced 3 deep dive reports: market size of green stormwater infrastructure, financial playbook, and then climate risks and opportunities. And I just mentioned to you that the design templates are coming next month. This is the financial report, by the way, and it is on our website, RISC.solutions. I really encourage you to consider actually reviewing this, because I personally come across 200-page long reports on the topic all the time, and it's very difficult to understand what is going on where. And in this report, which is 24 pages, maybe 24, 25 pages, you'll get a good overview of what we need to do so far as facilitating the finance of green stormwater infrastructure. So what are the 3 asks that we have, if I can be bold enough to ask you that? First of all, I would recommend you to consider following us on LinkedIn. We have a Twitter feed as well, and you're welcome to follow us on Twitter if you want. LinkedIn I personally prefer just because it's a little bit more professional. If you're a municipal leader, consider joining our cluster. Feel free to shoot me an email at sinha@ectinc.com. And last but not the least, I'm not really, if you feel that there is a large-scale stormwater infrastructure initiative that is going on in your area, and they could use creative financial or delivery solutions, shoot me an email. I'll be very happy to talk with you. And at the end of the day, I could very well recommend you to work with others. But we are trying to facilitate this across the Great Lakes. So just wanted to offer that as well. So what exactly is green stormwater infrastructure? They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I think this is a very easy way to describe it. So green infrastructure is really nothing more than what you already see perhaps in your neighborhood. So we are talking green gardens, we are talking trees are green infrastructure, greenways and park space are green infrastructure, bioswales are green infrastructure. Those are the things that convey water, for example, from a parking lot to a nearby area for detention and retention. Wetlands are green infrastructure. Green roofs are becoming more and more common nowadays. They are green infrastructure. Then we have green streets, alleys, and parking, and then rainwater catchment, and also porous pavement. Not so much, softer vegetation-based BMP, but still a very worthwhile green stormwater infrastructure BMP or best management practices. Just wanted to put our work in context. Doug Tallamy is a professor at University of Delaware. This is his quote, and he said, if half of the American lawns were replaced with native plants, we would create the equivalent of 20 million acre national park, which will be 9 times as big as Yellowstone and 100 times as big as Shenandoah National Park. So just to give you an idea, there are different paradigms that do exist. And the fact that we are used to seeing, large green lawns in our backyards or front yards, doesn't necessarily mean that is the only model that exists, just to encourage you to think about it. Here is a definition of green stormwater infrastructure, a little bit more complicated than the picture slide that I presented, which is range of measures that use plant or soil system, permeable pavement or other permeable surfaces or substrates, basically to store, infiltrate, or evapotranspire stormwater and reduce flows to sewer systems or to the surface waters. So that's what it is all about. Let me walk you quickly through infrastructure risks and opportunities. This slide basically showcases the global risks across the planet, and it comes from World Economic Forum's most recent report called Global Risks Report 2021. I don't have a lot of time to actually discuss this. The only thing I'll highlight here is look at the top row. In the year of 2020, which was the last time this report was updated, the first priority global risk is climate action failure Number 3 is biodiversity loss. Number 4 is extreme weather, and number 5 is water crisis. And to be honest with you, they are all very closely linked with each other. So unfortunately, it kind of underscores the importance of the work that groups like us are doing across the region and across the country. I just wanted to highlight that it is not just us thinking it is very important. Let's look closely at the Great Lakes then. Climate change in the Great Lakes. This is a slide from, or findings are from University of Michigan's Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessment team. And this talks about the changes over the last 60 years ending 2017. And you can see that the heavy precipitation events have increased by 35%. The average temperatures have increased by 2.3%. Guys, keep in mind that this is not a model prediction. I'm showing you the data points that has already occurred. So there is no, could this model be right or not? This is a fact basically that you are looking at. How does all of this climate change related stuff impact us? Well, need for investment in resilient water infrastructure has gone up. And here is an estimate from National Association of Clean Water Agency. And it basically tells you that we need close to $1 trillion to prepare water infrastructure for the impacts of climate change. Now, how about our recent past, 2020? Well, unfortunately, COVID hasn't really helped because the revenues in water, drinking water utilities and wastewater utilities have gone down by 17 to 20% in 2020. So that doesn't help. The picture basically gets worse. Here is a quick slide on the cumulative state revolving loan fund assurance agreements. And it tells you that while the work funded by Clean Water SRF and Drinking Water SRF has been very useful, the truth is we need multiple score, much higher level of funding on that, you know, $270 billion over the next 20 years for wastewater need, $470 billion for drinking water need. What does all of this mean? What it means is that the federal contribution to water infrastructure financing need is only of the scale of $2 to $3 billion a year when we really need 25 to 50 billion. So essentially we need to get creative. We need to drive down delivery costs. We need to leverage what we have, the little money that we have, and we need to find new sources of money. How do we operationalize intent for impact? How do we go about implementing green stormwater infrastructure at a large scale? Another quote from Helen Keller: "I long to accomplish a great and noble task, but it is my chief duty to accomplish small tasks as if they were great and noble." I mean, you really have to build on small scale successes if you are going to achieve a big dream. Here are some exciting changes on the horizon. On the left, I'm showing you some new terminology: community-based public-private partnerships. I'm a big fan of all of these 4 bullets, by the way. Green bonds have come on the horizon. Environmental impact bonds have come on the horizon. Impact investments have come on the horizon. Paul Herman, my co-author, is a globally renowned author on that, you know, expert on that. On the right, I have this month's Kiplinger Personal Finance magazine cover. The reason why I shared that with you is, you know, something has become mainstream when magazines like Kiplinger's devote 80% of their pages to the stuff that you're doing in your office. This specific issue was all focused on green bond ETFs and whatnot. So that has been very encouraging. What exactly is a CBP3? CBP3 is nothing more than a way to save money by aggregating a very large number of projects. And it's basically a partnership between public and private sectors. One 5-letter acronym to keep in mind: DBFOM: design, build, finance, operate, and maintain. Over the last 5 years, CBP3 started in 2016, and already there are $700 million worth of stormwater CBP3s in the country. I only highlighted the last one because it is a near and dear to our heart, because it's an outcome of RISC's work, led by Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District, which is a $20 million investment in the Great Lakes in green stormwater infrastructure. Here is their dream. Their dream is to get to zero sewer overflows by 2035 and improve receiving water quality. This first, stage project will result in 8.45 million gallons of water detention every year over the first 3 years. Their long-term game plan really is to do 740 million gallons per year, which means that as impressive as $20 million is, they intend to scale it up, assuming everything goes well in the first stage of the work. One quick slide on EIBs. EIBs are nothing more than a pay-for-performance contracts. sometimes people get very confused when you talk about EIBs. They immediately connect it to private capital. It could be funded by private capital, but actually, majority of the EIBs in the country are public capital funded, and it's not a grant, by the way. Only four EIBs in the country so far, totaling 55 million. Last one is again the work of RISC. We are in the process of finalizing a $55 million EIB, which will be the nation's largest environmental impact bond to the Great Lakes region. It should happen in early April. So really very excited about that. Let me now put our work in perspective. I have 2 more slides before I hand it over to Paul. Climate risks and opportunities, the current report that we are here to discuss. Keep in mind that the analysis that we carried out was for all of the Great Lakes states on the US side. There are 653 counties in the Great Lakes states. So sometimes, when you're somebody like me or someone like Paul that is engaged in risk, a key question is, who do I talk to first? And that was really the genesis of this specific report that Paul is going to discuss. So the key question that we were trying to solve was, what locations can most benefit from interventions related to a set of variables? These variables were chosen by me working together with Paul, and then Paul and his team did the data analysis and came up with a wide variety of actually metrics that he'll discuss with you. The first one is climate risk. So second is social vulnerability. Third is workforce agility. And the fourth is financial flexibility. And there is a very coherent, clear story and a theme that we are looking for. My last slide here then is our focus of risk is on water infrastructure in general, green stormwater infrastructure in particular. We are out here to, come up with new delivery and finance frameworks. We have a network to engage experts and leaders. I encourage you again to, reach out to me and anybody on my team from any organization that comes closest to your heart. Equity and equality is a key aspect of the work that we intend to push within the Great Lakes. Here is the information on my own background. You can see my email address. That's my office direct line. Again, the LinkedIn and the Twitter feed information, and then the risk solutions website information. And I think I stopped sharing. And I'll pass it on to Paul Herman. I've been very pleased to actually work with him, Paul, over the last year or so. I think his team brings in a lot of creativity to the region. And we're delighted to actually be a co-author together with him. So Paul, over to you. And you got to unmute
Sanjv,
yourself.
thanks for your leadership in all that you do for facilitating investing for higher impact, especially in green stormwater infrastructure, and for creating the RISC Coalition. I'm Paul Herman from HIP Investor, and a happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. And I'm from Chicago, so here's the Chicago River. Some would say it's usually this color. So Ron Harris, from Chief Resilience Officer from Minneapolis, can confirm or deny this when we have our joint panel. But the water is dyed extra green today, and that's even happening during the pandemic. So we thought that'd be a good transition into truly green stormwater infrastructure. As Laura kindly introduced, we have authored 2 books on impact investing. The first, The Hip Investor on the left, will have its 11-year anniversary this year on Earth Day. It's baked into the academic curriculum in finance for MBAs, MPAs, and undergrads. And on the right-hand side is the new Global Handbook of Impact Investing. So that's by 50 authors, built into 30 chapters, including specific chapters on climate impact bonds and green transition bonds, as well as diversity investing and gender lens investing and impact measurement. So feel free to check it out. And just a quick overview on HIP. This is our 15th year of action, helping facilitate impact and investment. So we are both a registered investment advisor, as well as a impact investing rating, impact ratings agency. And you can see that our clients include fund managers and indexes, as well as cities and counties. And so we're very active in publishing, like we are with this latest report on the climate risks and opportunities in the Great Lakes region. And so what we've brought together as the RISC Coalition, and Sanjeev and Ava from ECT, and Noah Strauss, who has a sustainability MBA from Presidio Graduate School. And our team has brought together is this report, which we'll dig into. Please feel free to ask any questions in the chat, and either I'll answer them along the way as we see them, or we'll discuss them in the panel, but feel free to add to the chat. So as Sanjv introduced, there are many challenges facing us, and we'll hear about this more in the panel. We have a climate crisis, we have a health crisis, we have an economic crisis and challenge, we have gaps in racial and ethnic equity, and I would also offer, we also have a trust and transparency and accountability crisis. So what we've put together in this report is a mix of metrics that cover climate, social, workforce, and financing, including deeper dives into vulnerability. So when you read the report, which is in the link in the chat at the councilgreatlakesregion.org blog, that you can click into there. It's a free report. You can check that out. All right, and the quick summary of the report, and we'll dig into a couple of each of those areas, is that the top 20 Great Lakes Basin US counties with the highest readiness, so with some of the most challenging climate issues, with social vulnerabilities and gaps, but with a ready workforce and available financing capacity, are these 20 counties that you see here. Now you see Chicago, my birth town and hometown, along with Ron's. You see Detroit and the counties around Detroit. You see Milwaukee County, and you see Cuyahoga County with Cleveland. You also see Erie counties, both in Pennsylvania and New York. And then you also see Upper Peninsula of Michigan next door to Wisconsin. The majorities of these areas are more dense. They're not only more dense with higher impervious surfaces, as you see here, and so that worsens the risks of stormwater overflow and water overflow in general. So you can see Cook County lined up with its density. You can see Detroit just across from Ontario, Canada, light up. And then not in the basin, but in the Great Lakes states, you can see New York area. But also interesting, you can see like middle of Ohio a little bit. From a social perspective, and so we analyzed other flood claims from climate as well, but just want to give you a taste of how this sorts out. In the social area, racially diverse counties do face greater economic inequalities from historic accumulated racist practices and redlining and lack of opportunity. So you can see those more racially diverse areas, again, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, also down on Southern Ohio and Cincinnati outside the basin. And it turns out when you do a correlation, and on the right-hand side, you can see this, the higher the percentage people of color, not only Black, but also Hispanic, Asian, Native American, the higher the proportion people of color, the more inequality, the more economic inequality. This is represented by the Gini index, which we know and love from economics. So we don't love the result, but this is the inequality that we're seeking to address. And so when we take that composite score of all these factors, climate, social, workforce, funding, and we plot that not to diversity, to the composite score, you can see that the ones in the green do tend to be larger areas. And so that they both have more talent, skilled talent and infrastructure to address these green stormwater infrastructure projects, to close the climate gap, but also to close the inequality gaps. And you see on the left-hand side, a lot of smaller counties. It's not that they don't have a need for it, they're just not as ready. So in the Great Lakes, the share of employment in the US, especially from manufacturing, has been eroding since the 50s. And so this sounds like bad news, but and has reduced the manufacturing plants producing output. How we look at it is that means that there's extra skills, workforce readiness, infrastructure available, just as former automotive plants are making wind turbines. and other green energy infrastructure, electric, available for electric vehicle infrastructure. It's also available for green stormwater infrastructure. And so the opportunities, there's plenty of opportunities to do that in regions of all sizes, but especially in the ones that we've highlighted. So there's a deeper dive into this in the report, including not only high school graduation rates and bachelor's degrees, but also the availability of that workforce, that skilled workforce, to learn new skills and learn them quickly. Many counties and states also have workforce training programs. And the size of the circles on these graphs is the population of the county. The fourth category, we covered climate, we touched on climate, we touched on social, we touched on workforce, is financing. And so financing is an interesting thing. Muni bonds, which we do quite a bit of work in at HIP, muni bonds fund either general obligation of cities and counties, but also of road authorities and of electric utilities and water utilities. And so there's more than 115,000 types of entities that could issue muni bonds. Cities and counties can also charge fees, as can water utilities, and road authorities can charge tolls. But as Sanjv introduced in the beginning, there's additional funding and financing structures, some of which might be on balance sheet with the cities as they consider new environmental impact bonds, special purpose bonds, project and infrastructure bonds, green bonds, or general obligation. So there's a deeper discussion on this in the paper. And so what is a challenge, though, is many of smaller cities or mid-sized cities, some of the top 20 are these smaller areas. There's an evaluation of all 650 counties in the Great Lakes and 200 plus in the Great Lakes Basin in the US. There's a challenge in how to pay for it. And frequently there's also a challenge in the finance and treasury groups to have a willingness to pay for something that isn't yet present. And as Sanjv introduced, we're already seeing the effects of climate and extreme weather events, whether they be snowstorms when unexpected or heat waves when not expected, as well as one of the first instances the other day of 2 tornadoes in the same place at the same time. So we're getting to live closer to the Wizard of Oz. All right, so what can we, if those are the readiness factors, what are our possibilities for funding? And one of the other items in the readiness also included whether it's a climate pledge. So there are more than 200 cities with sustainability officers and resilience officers like Ron Harrison, city of Minneapolis. Many of them have goals of as aggressive as, like San Luis Obispo, California, 100% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030. But there are many unfunded mandates in cities, counties, and government districts, and this is one of those frequently unfunded mandates. So the sources of capital to address climate action, especially green stormwater infrastructure, but also fossil-free energy, resource-efficient buildings, low-carbon transportation, zero waste to landfill, all these things you see on the left-hand side. There's 5 big groups of financing categories. Grant funding from nonprofits and foundations. Great Lakes Protection Fund is one that's active. Corporate grants. So this is interesting to tap. Ron may talk about this with companies like Best Buy and Target and 3M based in Minnesota. There's companies in each of your communities. There's government grants from federal and state. There's a whole group of loans, lines of credit, muni bonds, but high net worth investors have a larger balance sheet of millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that they may want to allocate to the community. So there's a category called place-based investing. There's private debt through PACE loans might apply in some of your communities, on-bill financing from utilities, as well as lease purchase agreements. There's private equity. We'll touch on opportunity zones in a minute. Climate tech is ramping up as a group. You've heard of fintech maybe, or biotech. Climate tech and insurance tech actually are ramping up in terms of funding ventures. And Energy Impact Partners is one. If you want to see like solutions in action, Energy Impact Partners is a venture capital firm that has a range of for-profit companies solving this. And then as Sanjv introduced the community-based public-private partnerships, we also like to call those multi-sector partnerships because it's not just public and private, it cuts across sectors, for-profit, nonprofit, government, academic, military even is going green. So those are some places to do that. So as we start to wrap up, this is a map you can find on the HIP Investor website. These are a variety, 30 different financing mechanisms, 8 different partnerships. And usually when we have new ideas about how to fund or finance, we're like, oh, that's never happened before. Everything listed here has an example. There's at least one done. So when you go talk to the CFO, treasurer, city manager, or mayor, or council, and they say, oh, has this been done anywhere before? Yes, all of these have been done somewhere before, at least once. And in my time back at McKinsey and in consulting, we always have clients who say, I want to be unique to do this, but tell me everywhere it's been done before. That's a human condition that we all suffer through. So the last 2 slides here are one, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals are an organizing framework, not only for countries now, but this is cascading into investment. And institutional investors from Europe and the Americas are now using this as an investment framework. So you can see in the middle here, sustainable cities and communities, SDG 11 is an SDG goal. Number 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure, as well as climate in 13, 14, and 15. So as you're considering these investments, look at how to map them to the SDGs and how they align. And that can help speak to investors willing to fund this. And then finally, opportunity zones. This is actually on, there are various forms of opportunity zone maps that you can see. This is right at the heart of the Great Lakes Basin. There's plenty of areas, both urban, suburban, and rural, that have opportunity zones that are creating tax benefits for impactful investments that are generally in lower income areas, but are underinvested and equity gaps that we need to close. So you can find those maps online, and those investments can be either real estate, venture-backed investments, or a combination of both. So that's a quick run through of the report. There's dozens of pages to dig into in the report. You can find your own county. We have a list of all the counties evaluated and the scores related to that, and happy to have a more in-depth discussion in just a moment. So I'll stop my screen share here, and Laura, back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Paul and Sanjv. Just a wonderful expert briefing. And when I saw your slides this morning, I thought, oh man, we're never going to get through this, and the amount of time that we'll have for Q&A, and you both have just done a superb job. And I will tell you that we have a really active chat going on as well. And it's really wonderful to have your co-author Noah here, Paul, because he's already been answering questions in the chat. So really appreciate that. So now we're going to transition to a panel discussion, and I'm going to remind you all that you can continue to put your questions and your comments in the chat. We're going to do our very best to get to all of them, but I do think we have a really rich conversation going on here. So right now I want to bring on Ron Harris. He's the Chief Resilience Officer of the City of Minneapolis. He's going to join us in this panel discussion. So hey, Ron, it's great to have you here. So I want to start by introducing the concept of a Chief Resilience Officer for a city like Minneapolis. So can you give us a little bit of a synopsis of that, your vision for the city and beyond, and also a place-based implications for the work that Sanjv and Paul have talked about?
Well, yes, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Laura. I'm so grateful to have to be on this panel with Paul and Sanjv, and so grateful for the work that you all have done to put this information together. There's never been a better time for us to identify how these issues impact us at an intersectional level, and also to show just how many opportunities there are for us to make a difference. You know, resilience is about adaptation. It's about how we become better as a result of our challenges. And our main challenges in Minneapolis really center around racial equity, economic inclusion, and the looming threat of climate change. I'd agree with Paul that we are facing what people are calling a five-headed horseman, so to speak, right? We talk about the racial inequities, we talk about economic exclusion, again, climate change. I would argue the pandemic, of course, has shown us where our vulnerabilities are. And then ultimately, we've had attacks on our democracy here in the US, and trust in government and those systems isn't going anywhere, right? So we have to continue to think about all these crises at once, recognizing that these things are becoming the rule and not the exception. And so we have to plan to make sure that we're incorporating all those things. My job as Chief Resilience Officer is to lead the strategy for how we build resilience, right? How do we invest in the adaptive capacity of our city enterprise, of our community, and our overall city, recognizing that the city is just a complex system of relationships. Resilience is about finding ways to not only bounce back, but how do we bounce forward? How can we actually be better as a result of our challenges? How can we actually emerge from the crisis in a better spot than we were pre-pandemic? Minneapolis has seen more than its fair share in challenges to our resilience. Pre-pandemic, we were already near the top of the list of states with the greatest racial inequity gaps because of the pandemic, and then the subsequent murder of George Floyd and all the unrest that occurred afterwards. These disparities are ever more apparent, and the mandate for change has actually never been stronger. But cities also are not static. Cities have, I'm sorry, hold on a second. Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
We can hear you just fine.
Perfect. Cities aren't static. They have always reinvented themselves in response to economic and social change, and they have to continue to evolve in response to this pandemic. Without a level of intentionality where we target specific communities for specific outcomes, the status quo is going to remain. We talked a little bit about the inequality as it relates to the green infrastructure efforts, and we know that these communities are vulnerable to a whole host of things. We have a huge opportunity in front of us to address longstanding gaps in that investment. We can prepare for our future by addressing and repairing injustices of the past. This can actually be a moment of reconciliation, of reparation, and of restoration. So in Minneapolis, we're set to receive about $281 million of stimulus recovery funding. And so right now we're in the process of shaping exactly how those funds are going to be spent, defining what success means to us. Success for me in shaping that funding is essentially that our most vulnerable citizens, as well as our city staff, are and feel more prepared to weather and adapt to the next crises. If this money is not used to build resilience, it'll be a complete waste. One of the things that I appreciate about the presentation was, you didn't call it this, but I noticed a key emphasis on resilience co-benefits, right? So how can we better optimize our interventions and our investments by tackling more than one issue at once? For example, Paul and Sanjv have shown pretty clearly the opportunities that exist for advancing green infrastructure. What if we also put in place funding for job training and workforce development so that the folks educated and contracted to do the work in community also come from the community where the work needs to be done, right? That way we're not only addressing some of our climate related needs, but we're also addressing some of our economic inclusion needs. We're also addressing some of our racial equity needs. Ultimately, we're also addressing how these place-based issues are woven together. And so we need to be thinking about this as more of a process than a project, recognizing the fact that those who are most vulnerable to climate impacts are also most vulnerable to dilapidated housing, are also most vulnerable to inadequate access to health insurance or healthcare, are also most vulnerable to not having access to good paying jobs or things like that, right? So we can solve for the most vulnerable in all of these aspects. And not only can we absolutely have to. Equitable and sustainable resilient cities must be about improving the quality of life for our citizens. That has to be our bottom line, right? We can talk about these things all day, but if they don't make a significant and tangible impact in the quality of life for people, how much does it actually matter? I think our cities' economies are densely woven tapestries that at the same time during this pandemic, our local government resources are limited. We do need multi-sector strategic partnerships with nonprofits, foundations, corporations, and others to aid in this recovery. And then we need those partnerships to last and extend far beyond the moment in time that we're in. Paul showed pretty clearly what the funding opportunities look like from a city perspective, but cities can't do this work alone. We have to create the kinds of access points that more sectors can aid in building our resiliency to climate and to other shocks. But we also need to communicate that collaboration is our new competitive advantage. We will solve these problems, but we'll solve them much more quickly and much more effectively, and better position our communities to thrive in the face of challenge if we activate partnerships and prioritize collaboration. That has to be the model. I see my role as Chief Resilience Officer in Minneapolis as simply the tip of the resilience spear. But the rest of the spear must be built out, right? As a city employee, as local government, we can help convene partners and we can help set an agenda, but ultimately that work has to be shared. The work of building resilience can't just come from the public sector. I'm excited that in Minneapolis, I get the opportunity to work with a network of businesses and philanthropy and other city leaders and community organizers on how we can actually do the work of sharing and building resilience. As we've seen, like I said, those who are most at risk and vulnerable to changes in the environment are also most at risk to contracting COVID-19. They're more likely to be the essential workers who don't have hazard pay and are more exposed, right? I can keep going down the list, but we have to recognize that we're only as strong as our most vulnerable citizens. We're only as strong as our most vulnerable communities. How can we design our solutions so that they center those who are most impacted? We know that when we solve for those who are the most vulnerable, not only do they benefit, but we all benefit, right? How do we break the cycle of disaster response and recovery? How do we wrap our responses to disaster in forward-looking and holistic and equitable resilience? As an example, when George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, there were so many people that stepped up to help out in community, help keep neighborhoods safe, help make sure that the elderly had access to medicine, help make sure that those who didn't have safe and stable housing had places to stay and food to eat. What if we as a city in partnership with funders and others actually resource people during non-emergency times, so that when emergencies do happen, they're ready to go and they're ready to be deployed, right? Instead of scrambling every time something happens, we have to build a coalition and bring people together and find funds and set an agenda. Why don't we do that when things aren't bad, right? Chop wood, carry water every single day, so that when these things happen, like I said earlier, these things are becoming more of the rule than the exception. And that means we need to continue to prepare for that. Then we're going to see another pandemic. We're going to see another economic recession. We're going to see instances of racial inequity. And we saw them last night, the Asian American women killed in Atlanta, right? My point in saying this is that we cannot approach these problems in isolation. The last thing I'll share is that I'm actually grateful to be a part of multiple city and practitioner-led networks that are leading on these issues every single day, that are bringing in equity in this conversation and resilience in ways that I haven't seen in quite a while. And I'll share links in the chat to these things, but one of those groups, the Resilient Cities Network, which is a collection of chief resilience officers like myself from around the globe who come together to help solve these issues. Within that, we have started last year, a community of practice that is focused on racial equity through resilience. And that's another practitioner-led, practice-based advocacy group centering racial equity and advancing resilience. I co-authored an op-ed that I'll share in the comments that talks a bit about that work. And finally, I'm a part of another coalition called R21, which is a coalition of practitioners and others who are working to shape federal policy. So we really want to take this message to the federal government and say, hey, stop trying to solve these problems in isolation, right? Again, we can find the intersections of this work. The final thing I'll say is that we need to come up with a way to prove value, that we can't forget about evaluation in the process of both addressing these challenges, but also building cities that are prepared to adapt for the future. That is my response to the awesome presentation that we had just saw. And I do believe that we need to continue to solve for those who are the most vulnerable. That's where we got to start. And it looks like with these efforts that we're on the pathway to doing so.
Thanks so much, Ron. Really, really appreciate your comments. I'm going to bring Sanjv and Paul back into the conversation. I'm going to ask you both to come off of mute because we've got lots of questions and there have been lots of questions asked in the chat. So I'm going to do my best here. And I think that you probably also have some questions that you've already answered in the chat. I've seen both Paul and Sanjv have done that. So if there's some points you want to make, and also that you may have questions for each other. But one of the first things that I wanted to ask you about came up really early in the conversation. And honestly, Sanjv, it was actually in your presentation. And one of our folks in the audience today had indicated there's a lot of financial estimations that you had about investments that should be done for intended areas and the purpose for the investments. And the question was, is that for the mitigation of negative impacts or adaptation or both? And where did those estimates come from? And then we had another follow-up question. So I'll ask you to think about it together is, and how much does it cost if we don't deal with it?
You know, the estimates that I'm using, Laura, they come from EPA, National, and then NACWA, which is the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, and then American Water Works Association. So they are mainstream estimates, and they really are focused on, you know, mitigation and adaptation both. So yeah, and what was the second question that you just asked?
Well, somebody else said it's going to cost a lot, but what is it going to cost if we don't do anything? So, you know, when we were trying to weigh those prices or the amount of money, I thought that was a really good point. You know, how can we inspire people there?
Paul, do you want to take that on, that part?
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the things we like to use is a temperature chart of what happens to Earth and our communities if we do nothing. And there's an estimate by Natixis, investment company based in Paris, global company. And they estimate that if we do nothing with our investments, we just invest in normal index investing like we might have in our retirement portfolios, that leads to a 4 to 5 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. And 4 to 5 degree rise in Celsius, for those of us who don't study Celsius every day, is like 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So if your body temperature wasn't 98 degrees, but 108 degrees, you would be dead. And that's what's that's the risk of not doing anything. If we don't do anything, if the Greenland ice sheet, which is now in the news again because we found little plants at the bottom of a mile of ice, if that melts, then sea level rise is 20 feet higher. Now in the Great Lakes, that's isolated because the Great Lakes have a higher, but that doesn't mean that extreme weather won't change or that the jet streams won't change. And all this will cascade into climate risks that affect our communities of people in the communities. So you can put numbers on that. The social cost of carbon has just been increased at the EPA by the incoming Biden administration, which is very helpful. That's like, what's the asthma and other health consequences from polluted air? So you can look at this analytically, you can also look at it emotionally, or you can also say things like, just talk to your kids. So for example, when the Capitol Hill, when Al Gore testified on Capitol Hill about green investing, he rode the Senate elevator. And in the Senate elevator, one of the older senators said, Al, I'm not going to understand anything you're going to say about science, but what I do know is my grandkids won't talk to me again if I don't vote for what you're talking about. So there's a mix of different arguments, emotional, analytical, scientific, all of which can help win over the audience to doing nothing. But the cost of doing nothing is immense. It's basically our lives.
Right.
Yeah, one additional point, Laura, if you don't mind my adding to the comments that Paul just made. A couple quick items. First of all, the work that we are trying to do across the Great Lakes and others across the country, you know, at the end of the day, don't kid yourself. You really need to come up with a value proposition that is over and beyond what the municipalities are getting right now. Even if you just go as a single silo issue of implementation of green stormwater infrastructure, I need to be able to prove to the CFO of a community that through community-based public-private partnership or through large-scale aggregation, whether it is through environmental impact bonds or green bonds, the costs to the ratepayers need to be lower than what they are currently doing. To give you an example, the work that we are leading in MMSD, their operation and implementation cost for using grain systems was of the order of $2.62 per detained gallon that they had. And they hired the CBP3 Green Infrastructure team by challenging that team to bring that cost down to $2.20 per gallon detained. So we need to show, you know, cost superiority, and you know, if you do aggregation, et cetera, you should be able to do that. The other thing that I wanted to touch upon is when you do large-scale green stormwater infrastructure, it is interesting that Ron actually kind of gave a sort of example of that. In larger scale paradigms or models like CBP3 in Milwaukee or EIB in Buffalo and elsewhere, you can have societal co-benefits. For example, in Milwaukee, there is workforce training is a part of the way the private partner is going to get paid. And 5-year maintenance. I mean, one of the biggest challenges in green stormwater infrastructure that nobody wants to talk about is many cities that are really progressive. They actually have public works officials that have no interest in using green stormwater infrastructure because their staff don't really understand how to do the maintenance. So by doing these large scale setups where you have a private entity that actually does all of that, you are able to bypass that and you can provide those sorts of trainings to the local residents to engage that. So you have to provide cost efficiency, you have to build in societal community benefits, and it all needs to go together in order to be a compelling value proposition. Back to you, Laura.
Paul, I just wonder if you want to chime on. I noticed that you just put something in the chat here in terms of the return on investment.
Yeah, I gave a lot of emotional arguments because sometimes that's what it takes to move people. And I'd love to hear Ron's experience in getting a city to move forward. So the one thing I'll say before throwing it over to Ron is there are many positive return on investment. There are many investments that have a positive ROI and that do things like improve the environment, reduce greenhouse gases, reduce energy, make things more efficient. So energy efficiency software does that. Water optimization does that. So there's, Sanjeev got straight to the crux of it, which is lower cost, higher value, or to the financial part. If people have to move away because they can't live or work there, what's going to happen to the tax base? And so what's the insurance that both either welcomes more people to your community or that removes the desire for people to move away? But Ron, how's it working with your experience?
Not great, to be honest with you. We're in a similar spot as other cities where we're trying our best to take advantage of the moment so that we can optimize how we do this. One of the things that's giving me a lot of, make me feel good about this is we've developed multiple kind of multi-sector partnerships with some of the Fortune 500 companies that are in Minneapolis. If for those who don't know, Minneapolis has the highest concentration of Fortune 500 companies in the metropolitan area. And so what we're trying to do is create a roadmap for how these companies can help invest in the environment that they have benefited from for so many years, right? That they benefit from a highly trained workforce. They benefit from a pretty business-friendly regulatory environment. They benefit from pretty high standards as it relates to sustainability and carbon reduction goals, right? So the city has done and the state have done a lot of things to make it a pretty friendly climate for business. And this is our opportunity to ask for a little bit back, right? I think that when George Floyd was murdered in particular, companies started to wake up and say, okay, we actually have a hand in shaping the outcomes of our city. We've benefited from this environment for a long time. Now we want to figure out ways to contribute back. So I guess how it's working in Minneapolis right now is that we're trying to set up the processes that facilitate that kind of partnership. So if I can't get funds from a big corporation, can I get a pro bono consulting team, for example, to work on a project on 38th Street corridor where George Floyd was murdered, for example? Can I, if a company can't give me, $100,000 or $1 million that I'm asking for, can they conduct the research that my city doesn't have the capacity to do? And so really trying to break down pieces and elements of this and positioning some private sector actors and others to aid in helping us build out what the plan is. And the other part of this too is what we're trying to do is get them to be a part of shaping what the plan looks like as well. Right. We don't want to create, like I'm in the middle of creating a resilient Minneapolis strategy right now, a second version that takes into account what we went through this past year. I don't want to write this by myself, nor do I want to write this with just city staff. I want to write this with the heads of Target Corporation. I want to write this with Best Buy. I want to write this with other actors in our community because, like I said before, cities can't do this work alone. The final thing I'll say is when you have a tangible project, it makes it a little bit easier for other actors to see themselves in that work. One of the projects that I'm really, really excited about doing, and we're just now getting off the ground, is the concept of a resilience hub, which is really, if you're not familiar, it's a community-facing building, right? A community-facing center that operates at the intersections of everything that we had talked about before. So right now we're scoping one out on 38th Street where George Floyd was murdered, that it's an existing community center. It needs some infrastructure investment. So we're looking to see how much it would cost to put solar on the roof, store it, solar plus storage, things like that, looking at stormwater management on site. Also wanted to position that community center or the resilience hub to be a place for emergency preparedness and emergency management. Trying to see if we can get vaccine distribution there, PPE distribution there, a site for workforce development and job training, right? You can go down the list with the opportunities that we can do if we put that product together. And we're starting to see people come together and kind of like stone soup, right? They're bringing their thing to it. This is what I can contribute. This is what I can contribute. And they're starting to help drive our city towards more resiliency, and they don't even know it yet, right? So that's the other piece of this too, is by broadening out a more holistic resilient framework, it allows for more actors to get involved and to see themselves in the work that we're doing.
Stone soup helps with water displacement too, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So Ron, how about, is there anything with Target or Best Buy or 3M or other corporates, either that have sustainability or ESG or even sustainable development goals? Is there action on that front?
There is, another thing we're trying to do is similar to shaping the strategy with these institutions. We also want to help set goals with them as well and say, hey, guess what? We can't actually meet our climate goals if you all don't play a significant role in helping us advance those things. It gets challenging because, as you know, in finance, we have to come up with some unique finance mechanisms, because when money comes directly to the city, it's very hard to do, spend it and invest it in the way that we want to without getting bogged up in the process and things like that. So again, in my experience thus far, and we're just now trying this out, but when we invite folks to the table from different sectors, right, particularly our Fortune 500s, and we give them the space to help us co-create these goals, we get a lot more participation. And then the same is on the flip side. When we bring community to the table and we say, what are the things that what does resilience mean to you? What are the ways that you could be better prepared for the next crisis? What are the things that the city can do to make sure that you feel better prepared, and work with us with those things? Again, we're seeing better buy-in. Where we see the most challenge is when we try to go about it alone and don't develop those kinds of partnerships.
And Sanjv, what was the secret in Milwaukee and Buffalo that they've done something so progressive?
That is a really good question, Paul, and I can always count on you to ask awesome questions. I think at the end of the day, perhaps the most important ingredient to the stone soup that Ron was discussing earlier is a local visionary that has taken an idea and understands the importance of pushing the edge of basically the boundaries. In Milwaukee, Kevin Schaefer and the team that is around him, Karen Sands, Nadia Vogt and others, and their current CFO, it took us a little bit of time, a year or so, to work with them to showcase various options that they should consider pursuing. But Kevin was behind it from day one, and we were able to actually talk to, because it's not easy for a municipal leader to all of a sudden come with a completely new set of ideas. So I really respected him for that. In Buffalo, also, it was the same thing. Kevin Mindell is the Green Stormwater Infrastructure Program Director, and O.J. McFoy, who is the General Manager / CEO of Buffalo Sewer Authority, are in the same league. These guys are very impressive people that are not happy with the status quo, and they are willing to experiment. And once you make the argument that the costs are less than what you would otherwise do, they were willing to come on board. I think I would be remiss if I didn't emphasize that, our focus of this specific RISC, guys, is the Great Lakes region. And I want to emphasize to you to understand that we are not producing just reports and publications with our awesome authorship that people can put us in a footnote in future publications. We are here to do implementation similar to Milwaukee and Buffalo. And I would really encourage you to consider looking at these case studies as they are happening within the region. That way we don't have to go and make the case that it is a completely foreign idea. It is not. It's already here. And if you can afford $5, consider buying Kiplinger's Finance magazine. It is all about green bond ETFs. None of this is new anymore. So I think we are heading in a, collectively as a society, I think we are heading in a direction that is much more compassionate than perhaps it used to be in the past. And I think that our priorities are getting sorted out, even in professional arena, because of that. So I think having a visionary leader, going back to the question that you asked, Paul, is perhaps the most important ingredient of all of the things that I could attribute the successes there to.
Well, we're hoping that the conversation today will inspire and inform more visionary leaders. But one of the things that's just come up in the chat that I wanted to also highlight is we just have an announcement of a big stimulus package and infrastructure opportunities. I'm just going to go to you, Ron, first to say, how do you see that being put to work for these kinds of projects in cities like Minneapolis?
The good news about this round of stimulus is that it's less restrictive than the other rounds of stimulus, so that there are so many efforts that we can justify that are part of recovery. And I think the first thing that we have to do, though, is instead of rushing to figure out what projects that we need to fund, we need to define what success means for us as we spend those dollars, right? So I was in a conversation yesterday with city staff, and we were rushing and we were trying to put together a bunch of projects on a spreadsheet that can be funded or what have you. And I was like, wait, we need to pause for a minute. What would be the biggest impact that we can make with, the $300 million that are coming, right? This is an awesome opportunity to provide restorative justice, for example, right? Looking at the fact that in the US, 400 years of racial, of racism, frankly, can we leverage this as an opportunity to start a process of restoration? Or can we start to build a foundation by which we, this is how we evaluate policy moving forward? So again, it's certainly about how we spend the money now, but it's also about setting ourselves on a trajectory to always ask these similar kinds of questions as it relates to this kind of proactive work. So the good news about it is that, again, my city is starting to see how these issues are so intersectional, and that we're making the case that, yeah, one of the ways that we close racial gaps is making sure that from a stormwater management perspective, that we, instead of wait for communities to come to us and say, hey, we need this managed, we're going to proactively go in and figure out what sites, what are the hotspots in the city, for example. Now that seems like it's something that should be common, but it's actually not, right? We actually need to be in these spaces to ask these questions. So in a moment where we're getting that much investment and that much recovery funds, it allows us the opportunity to ask more questions and set ourselves on a trajectory and put ourselves through a process that we always ask those questions and we always target the communities that need it the most. I'm a big fan of the curb cut effect. I talk about it almost every opportunity that I get. And the curb cut effect is a concept coined by Dr. Angela Glover Blackwell, formerly of PolicyLink. And the basic premise is that the curb cut was a design option for sidewalks that centered the ADA community, right? So by centering those that are most at risk or most vulnerable, came up with the curb cut so that it's easier for folks to get their wheelchairs or what have you from sidewalk to street and vice versa. But guess who else benefits from that? The father pushing this kid in the stroller benefits from that. The kid on his bike, or who has the rope with his rollerblades behind the bike, benefits from that, right? Seniors benefit from that. So many people benefit from that one action, but the only reason why everybody got to benefit from that action was because we targeted those that were the most vulnerable. So when it comes to the stimulus funding, whether we invest all of it in green infrastructure and stormwater management, or whatever we decide to do, we have to make sure that we're starting with those who are most impacted. It would actually be really great if we invited those who are most impacted to help us shape that funding, right? We're all very, very smart people, but we're not smarter than those who are actually going through the things that we're trying to mitigate and prevent. How can we bring them to the table so they can help direct us on how those investments should be shaped and ultimately implemented? We just have such an awesome opportunity to do things so differently. If we're going to tackle the climate challenge, if we're going to tackle the racial inequities, if we're going to tackle any of these problems, it requires us in city government to govern differently. So how can we use a moment like this to set a process for governing differently?
And I'll just,
That's a great question to end, a great answer to a question. So thank you. Paul, I'm going to ask you, we've had so many great questions amongst yourselves and also in the chat, but we're running out of time. So Paul, I want to give you an opportunity to make some last comments, perhaps on some things that you've observed or wanted to make a comment on with regards to return on investment.
Sure. Just quickly, there have been some chats in the site about individual investors who've progressed this, funding companies, funding real estate. There's also been, like from Stuart, about CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions. These are banking institutions on the front line, credit unions, banks. There's also the Global Alliance for Banking on Value. So like Sunrise Bank is in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, St. Paul. There's partners in the community willing to act already and willing to invest for impact. They may not pay for large infrastructure projects, but they could play, like Sanjv was saying, just start small, just get it rolling on a small basis. So the numbers are there for many positive ROIs. So if the finance people are asking tough questions, just start with the ones that have a positive ROI. And the pictures that Sanjv showed at the beginning about like bioswales and simple things like parking lot, like even do like a high school student like simulation of burning off the tires of your little toy car. Where does that go? It goes into the water. Well, what happens when it goes into the water? The fish eat it. Well, then who eats the fish? We eat the fish. So we actually do need to think about drainage, biodiversity, pollution. Like these are all connected. So this systems thinking is something that's critical. And the good news is people in cities generally do like to think in a system. That's why they're there, to help people, to create well-being. So there's, we're here to say with this report, with the RISC report, the RISC.solutions website, the financing challenges, these have all been done at least once. They may not have been done at the scale that or uniqueness that your city needs, but it's ready to go. So, and these sessions are recorded here that you can share to get people educated. But just find easy on-ramps, to get people started. And then that success begets success. So that I'll pause there.
Sanjv, any final comments from you?
My final comments are just to showcase the two gentlemen that are with me. I'm so lucky to actually have access to their collective wisdom as a part of RISC. And I hope that their presence on RISC team encourages others to join us. I also wanted to thank CGLR team, Laura, you, and Mark for inviting us here. Very, very appreciative. And I will be, I wanted to also thank the Great Lakes Production Fund for having sponsored my work for a while now. Dave Rankin, Steve Cole, I don't know if they are on the call right now, but thank you very much. And others, foundations like Dr. Neil Hawkins from our foundation and others that are all collectively walking the same path that we are trying to walk. So thank you very much. That's my final comment.
Well, I just thank all three of you. It's been a wonderful conversation. I know we could have stayed on probably another hour, but we're going to wrap it up here and I'm going to turn it back over to Mark Fisher.
Well, thanks, Laura. And like you, I want to thank our panelists for another fantastic discussion today. I thought I knew a lot about green stormwater infrastructure and infrastructure generally, but I think you've opened our eyes in so many different ways. And Ron, just thank you for adding your voice to this conversation. Without a doubt, we see it every day that this region from an economic standpoint does move at two speeds. There's a lot of people who are left out, left behind, whether it's Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, Chicago, Milwaukee. When we think about building a better future for the Great Lakes, our competitiveness, our sustainability, it needs to be an inclusive future. It needs to be a diverse future. And that requires us to fundamentally rethink about how we organize those conversations, and not from the top down, but from the community up. And so I can't say enough about, I think, the perspectives and insights that you shared today. And I really appreciate that, Ron. And the same for Sanjv and for Paul. Again, I think through your research, I think you've really shown us how do we need to be thinking about this issue, not just from a climate change perspective, but from a social economic perspective, and how these things intersect. And ultimately, how do small and medium-sized communities need to think about them, how they can collaborate across their own counties and cities to perhaps do do something together and have a bigger impact when the financial resources might not be there for them to do it on their own. And so again, I think the report is very much appreciated, and I think it's really shown the way in terms of how do we start this conversation across the Great Lakes. So thank you again for joining us today. And for those who have listened in, if you have other ideas in terms of conversations you want us to plan for this year, please reach out to Laura or I. I can be reached at mark@councilgreatlakesregion.org, and Laura can be reached at laura@councilgreatlakesregion.org. We really want to hear from you and organize more discussions like this over the next year. So thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it.